I'm here with Dominic Lopes, and Dominic has written a brilliant book called A Philosophy of Computer Art, which is published by Routledge, and we're here to talk about it. Great to meet you, John.
Thank you very much. Good to meet you as well.
I really enjoyed your book, and it seems to me an important book about computer art. It's the first book that I've seen that is written by a philosophy professor or a professional philosopher. I mean, I've read all sorts of books on media art, and internet art, and digital art, and digital poetry. But this is the first one that I've read about computer art, and more specifically the first one that I've read that's written by a philosopher. So I was thinking, okay, well, gee, I wonder what a philosophy of computer art could be. How does that differ from a great yak, from a great talk about computer art? And what does he mean by computer art as opposed to digital media or digital art, or any of these other terms that you run across? So a philosophy of computer art, how does it differ from a great yak about computer art?
Well, maybe it is a great yak about computer art. A great yak. Maybe it's more helpful for me to say how a philosophy of computer art differs from other approaches to thinking about computer art. There are different ways of thinking about computer art, digital art, new media art. And I have to say that I felt compelled to write this book because I felt that there was a need for a philosophical voice at the table. I felt that philosophy could bring something to the discussion of computer art and new media art that wasn't already there. Most people who think and write about computer art basically view it from a, very broadly speaking, historical perspective. So they're interested in its origins, and they're interested in not only in its origins and early uses of the new technology, but also in its precursors. And that's important work to do. It's good work to do, but because there's an assumption that there's a continuity between computer art and precursors, often there's a stress on the connections to early 20th century art movements like Dadaism. Because there's a stress on that continuity, I think that it's sometimes missed just how new computer art is. So I don't want to criticize those other approaches. I think it is important to recognize that there are continuities and to understand what those continuities are. But there are also some, I think, very interesting, completely new features of these new artistic practices. And for me, I think that philosophy is a very good way to get at that, because what a philosopher does is he or she steps back from history, steps back from contingency as much as possible. Of course, you can't entirely do it, but that's what we try to do. We're trained to do it, we're disciplined to do it. And look at phenomena from a conceptual perspective. And when you look at them at computer art from a conceptual perspective, you try to get a sense of what it is and what makes it different from other things. Philosophers are trained to look for difference and for relevant similarities, but mostly for difference. And so I think that what the philosophical approach to computer art brings to the table is a sharp sense of new departures. And that's what this book tries to get at.
One of the things that I got from the philosophical approach that I really appreciated was there are a few terms that are rigorously defined. I mean, quite rigorously defined. It's like, it's computer art, you have A, B, C, and D. Mm-hmm. And then there's consequences that follow from the definitions. It's not quite definition, lemma theorem, but...
yeah, it's not exactly math.
No, it's not exactly math, but there is that sort of formal system, definition, consequence to the presentation of it.
Mm-hmm. It's not exactly math. You're a poet. I think in a way it's like poetry. In good philosophy, you have an austerity, you have an efficient use of resources, conceptual resources. What we want to do is we want to not get carried away and try to put too many ideas in there, but rather see if we can come up with a framework of like little cogs and wheels that do some work very, very efficiently. And so that's what you're describing as the rigor in this book is all about. If we can come up with a few well-connected ideas, what they will do is give us a framework for thinking about a phenomenon.
I'm going to read a little quote from the book. You say, few generations in all of human history have been lucky enough to witness the birth of a new art form. And you maintain that computer art is a new art form. And how is computer art a new art form?
Mm-hmm. That's the big question of the book. The thesis of the book is, the claim of the book, the take-home message is, computer art is a new art form in the way that painting was a new art form at about 50,000 years ago, or the movies were an art form, a new art form about 100 years ago. Computer art is a new art form. What's new about computer art is that the materials are new. In a way, the materials aren't new, and this is why it's so easy to miss the newness of computer art, because when you look at works of computer art, you see images, you see text, you see dance-like movements, you see moving images, and it looks like, as I put in the book, old wine in new bottles.
So what is the new material?
The new material is this, that in computer art, the person who's engaging with the work does something that shapes the way the work is presented to them. Shapes what I call the display of the work, the way it appears to them. And the artist is controlling that shaping activity.
It's interactivity of a particular type that is the new material then?
Interactivity is the word that I use.
No, we can imagine works of computer art, surely, that aren't interactive with the audience, but maybe they're responding to weather data, or maybe they're responding to, something else, as opposed to responding to the audience. Would that still be interactivity? Or are you focusing on interactivity with the audience?
Yeah. So it's for me, it's not so much our choice of words that matters. It's what those words signify. And it's not so much that I want to say, okay, we have one phenomenon here and it's more important. I just want to say we have a range of different kinds of phenomena. Okay, so take a case of a work of art that's reacting to the weather, just a mobile sculpture. It's blown around in the wind. Okay, so it's changing because of what the weather does. And that's very interesting.
Could be.
It could be very interesting. It might be completely uninteresting, but you can think of that as a material that the kinetic element of the sculpture is a material that the artist has to use, and their use of that material can be a good achievement or a poor achievement. And so we can think of it that way. And that's fine. We can call that interactivity if you like. But what I want to say is let's focus on those works that are interactive. Let's don't worry about the words, but in the following sense. This is the idea that I want to get at. That the shape of the work, the display of the work, the way the work seems to us, is affected by what we, the audience members, do.
Right. Other forms of art aren't themselves reacting to the audience. There's theater where the people are responding to the audience, where the actors are possibly responding to the audience. And so the audience is shaping it partly there, but it's not the same thing, is it, as in computer art, where there's there's a different kind of interactivity, there's a different kind of influencing the display.
It's very important to get clear on this point, I think, and many scholars and critics who are interested in new media art aren't very clear on this point. It's absolutely true that whenever we engage with any work of art, we bring something to it. We do bring something to it, and what we bring to it shapes our experience of it. We're not out of the equation as individuals, as members of audiences. We're part of that equation. Our experience of it is partly determined by what we bring to the work. And that's true across the board. And that's sometimes called interactivity. But I'm talking about something much more than that. It's not that what we are and what we do shapes our experience of the work, it shapes the work itself. So maybe it's useful to just think of an example. It could be that you're looking at a computer screen and you've got a mouse in your hand, and the movements of the mouse in your hand determine what words of a poem are displayed to you. So something as simple as that. That's quite different from who you are shaping your experience. It's who you are is shaping the words of the poem. T.S. Eliot selected words of a poem to be displayed on paper, while your mouse movements, through some magic of the artist, are selecting the words that are showing up on screen. That's the new thing. It's not completely unprecedented. So in the book I talk about Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate in the Millennium Park in Chicago, in the United States. And that is very simply, it's a kind of a, people sometimes call it the bean. It's a bean-shaped, convex, mostly convex sculpture with a highly polished mirrored surface. And if you simply walk up to it, you'll see your mirror image in that surface. And in a way, what you do determines the features of that surface. Your reflection in that surface is a result of your actions. So it's interactive. And so there are works in traditional art forms that have a kind of interactivity. But in computer art, you have an art form or a practice that develops around the notion of interactivity and really explores it. And so that's the new thing. It's not that interactivity is entirely new. It's that interactivity in computer art becomes the basis of a practice and is systematically taken advantage of and explored by artists.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to your emphasis on interactivity because that is one of the things that interests me most when I encounter computer work. Is what is the interactivity doing? Is it central to it? Is there a lot of character to it? Mm-hmm. Is there a real sense of discovery in the interactivity? Is it just a page turner, or are we creating the universe? Is it super pretend, or is it just a technical thing of being a page turner? This is something that I think people are quite curious about when they encounter works of computer art, the nature of the interactivity.
So can I say something about the last chapter of the book? This is a little controversial, I think.
About games?
About games. So the last chapter is about computer games, and the question there is, are they works of computer art? Are computer games works of art? And there's a deep and serious reason why I think it's useful to ask that question. And it's because what grabs us most in the new technology, not from a sort of a business efficiency perspective, but from a perspective of play, is games. Mm-hmm. And I think that in many successful, not all, but many successful works of computer art, they kind of capture that sense of play, and that embodies an understanding of how interactivity can be engaging. Mm-hmm. The interactivity of games is a really good model, I think, for the interactivity of what you might think of as more serious computer art.
I agree. And I found your take on games quite interesting, actually. You said that games are the most popular type of computer art.
Mm.
And that seems to me to be true. They're immensely popular, aren't they? And they're usually wonderfully interactive. And, it doesn't have to be Sophocles to be art, does it?
This is something that is, that I think that this is one of those things that a philosopher can bring to the table. Because we want to be rigorous in not making assumptions that are bound to culture. Mm-hmm. When we think about music, we think about the Beatles and Billy Joel, as well as Beethoven and Shostakovich. Mm-hmm. They're all music, and if we're interested in music as a human phenomenon, I think that we should be interested in all kinds of music, and not just what you can think of as the high art end, and ignore the kind of lowbrow end. Uh-huh. And there is still, because computer art is so new, I have to say, there's some anxiety in the computer art community to establish its high art credentials.
Right.
As a philosopher, I don't care about that. I'm quite happy to say, look,
and
computer art games are one end and one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, you get the very serious stuff that's shown at Ars Electronica and in MoMA and places like that.
Right.
But I think it's all one phenomenon displayed in different ways for different kinds of audiences.
Are you also a computer scientist, or what is your background that way?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not a computer scientist. I guess there's two parts to the answer to that question. One is that I've been a hands-on computer user for a long time at a
from quite a young age.
From a young age, at a building level as well as a using level. So I've hacked around with computers and built little bits of computer code to do various things, and it's mostly for me a kind of a hobby. I've never done it professionally, but I understand the insides of a computer and how it works, and from a builder's perspective, how it works, and I think that's a very important perspective to have. User's perspective is great, but the builder's perspective is an intimate one.
But have you also studied things like Turing's work and Gödel's work?
So that's the second part of the answer. I'm, as a philosopher, mostly interested in art. But for most of my career, I've been interested in art as a cognitive phenomenon, as a product of the human mind-brain working at its best, at its highest levels. I've always thought that if you want to understand the brain, if you want to understand the mind, the human mind, it's very useful to look at artistic productivity. And so you can ask questions like, what is creativity? What does it take for a mind to be a creative mind? Why would we have evolved creative capacities? What do they do for us? So I've always been interested in questions about the human mind and in what we call philosophy of mind, cognitive science. And given that interest, Turing is one of the pioneers, for instance. And so I teach philosophy of mind, and I teach computational theories of mind, where scientists say, look, the human brain is not exactly like an IBM computer. We know that. But if we try to build a computer that does some of the things that the human mind does, maybe in a different way, will still tell us something about how the human mind works. So many philosophers have pretty good knowledge of computational theories of mind, of how computers work as a result, and I'm in that group of philosophers. So I also have that kind of perspective. It doesn't come out so much in this book, but it does in some of my other work.
You clear up some commonly misunderstood issues in the book quite well, such as that games preclude meditation, and that was a good one. I run across this objection to, well, some of my work actually, but to computer art more generally, that say it's a game. Well, that doesn't involve meditation at all. Whereas you say that after the game, at some points during the game, there's room for meditation on the multiple displays of the game.
Many people who think about computer art or digital art are very suspicious of what they call immersion.
Mm-hmm.
And what they contrast with distance. Distance, they think, is a really good thing, and immersion is a bad thing. And immersion is this, you know, you can really see with computer games, you get totally absorbed with what's going on in front of you. And that is why it's so much fun. And I think that many compelling works of computer art that are not games, more serious works as it were, are also immersive in that way. I mean, they really pull you in, and you're just completely focused on the changes in your environment that the machine is producing as a result of what you do. And so you try something else, and you see what happens, and you try something else, and you see what happens. That's immersive.
Right.
And so many critics are very suspicious of immersion. They think it's a trap where we lose autonomy because we can't step back and think about what's really happening. And I think that this is a fallacy. And to see how it's a fallacy, just think about you playing of any ordinary game like chess. So when you play chess, you can have a good game with a friend, and then the next day you have another game and it's a less good game, and then a couple of weeks later you have another game. And each of those games you can think of as good games or less good games, more interesting, more challenging, or less interesting, less challenging. But you can also think about chess as a game. You can imagine having an argument with a friend about whether chess or Scrabble is a better game. And there you're not thinking about the particular playings of each game. You're thinking about Scrabble, the quality of Scrabble, as giving you an opportunity to play all these different individual Scrabble games. And the quality of chess as giving you an opportunity to play all these different individual chess games. And how do you get a sense of the quality of chess or the quality of Scrabble? Only by playing the individual games. And not so much while you play them, because when you're playing chess, you're thinking about, oh, where do I move that pawn to get out of this trap? Or when you're playing with Scrabble, you're thinking about, how can I really trap my opponent now? Right, by just playing one or two tiles. And you're not thinking about, is Scrabble a good game or is chess a good game? So as you play individual games, you're not thinking so much about the game of Scrabble or chess itself in the abstract. But in between playing, that's what you do. You can think, boy, I think of all the chess games I've played in my life, and I realize that chess has certain characteristics. Or I think of all the Scrabble games, and as a result of playing those Scrabble games, I have a sense of what the game Scrabble is about and what it does for me. Well, works of computer art are immersive in their individual playings, in just the same way as games are immersive in their individual playings. But in between those playings, we can step back and think, boy, you know, when I played Grand Theft Auto the first time, I had this sort of sense of it, and now it's playing these tricks on me, and it's surprising me in certain ways. What's going on with this? And you create a story about the game itself, and you get a sense of the game itself. And that is all the distance you need. So if you're worried about immersion and the dangers of immersion, and if you think that quality comes from distance, computer art gives you distance at the same time as it gives you immersion. It's a nice balance. It gives you all of the benefits of immersion, all that fun. And it gives you the opportunity to step back and say, okay, each of these immersive experiences tells me something about the work itself.
Well, you do take up the fear that and suspicions that surround computer art, and possibly it's part of the phenomenon of people being suspicious about machines and computers more generally as well. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I should say, I talk quite a bit in the book about various critiques, I call them, of computer art. And I do that for two reasons. First, because I think that they're out there and you've got to grab the bull by the horns and say, you know, what's true in these critiques? What do we really need to worry about? And what do we not so much need to worry about? Mm-hmm. But also the critiques actually give us a sense of what we think computer art is. So they're very useful because they contain assumptions about computer art and its value. And so we can, if we think about the critiques, we can learn something about computer art. So, yeah, we are, we're a little bit afraid of machines, I think. We're probably right to be a little bit afraid of machines. I don't want to say that we shouldn't be. Of course we should be a little bit afraid, rationally, right? You know, we need to get a good, rational sense of what the dangers really are, and we need to be careful and thoughtful about it. Sometimes that fear of machines shades off into phobia, becomes irrational. But that does tell us something about the nature of what we're looking at. It is, I want to stress, computer art is not just interactivity. It's interactivity that takes advantage of certain kinds of technologies, computational technologies in general, but more specifically electronic technologies. They don't have to be electronic, but they mostly are.
There's this wonderful quote from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and I don't know whether I can find it quickly. Do you know where it is?
It's right at the end of the book, isn't it? Yeah, page 120.
Page 120. Yeah, so Samuel Taylor says, where it prevails as a habit, it occasions in time the entire destruction of the powers of the mind. It is such an utter loss that it is not so much to be called past time as kill time. It conveys no trustworthy information as to facts. It produces no improvement of the intellect, but fills the mind with a mawkish and morbid sensibility, which is directly hostile to the cultivation, invigoration, and enlargement of the nobler faculties of the understanding, which you say sounds a bit like some of the critiques of contemporary computer art, but you point out that he was actually writing about the current, at his time, which was around the time of the French Revolution, so end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, he was talking about the novel, which was the new art form of the time.
I say the hot new art craze of the day, which is what it was.
Right.
And people thought it's dangerous and women shouldn't read novels. It will corrupt them to read novels.
Right.
And parents who worry about their children playing computer games shouldn't be so worried about that. Let me elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure.
I think we often think, and this is right to think this way, we often think about the instrumental benefits of art. Reading novels is okay because it sharpens your reading abilities, teaches you how to spell, teaches you about the 19th century, it makes you an educated person, you can make witty remarks in cocktail parties. Comic books, not so much, because, we all can get pictures anyway, you're not really learning anything there, and Godzilla and the Japanese manga characters don't seem to be so relevant for cocktail parties and job interviews, and so parents tend to worry there's fewer instrumental benefits to comic books, and video games are dangerous because they keep the kids in the basement when they should be outside playing and exercising. And they should be outside playing and exercising. I don't want to say that they shouldn't. And if they play too much video games and they become obese, that is a problem. But I want to point out that although it's useful and appropriate to think about the positive spin-offs that we get from art, art isn't just about positive spin-offs. It's, going back to philosophy of mind, 40,000 years ago, human beings started to paint paintings on the walls of caves. They probably did it before that, we just don't have their record of those earliest paintings. It's amazing, the minute that we could figure out we could do this, we did it. There were musical instruments that go back, so there's a bone flute that's about as old, it's about a bit more than 40,000 years old. And it's got musical intervals in it, recognizable musical intervals. As soon as our brains reached a certain point of development, we started to make art. I think that art is part of us. We cannot do without it. Most people cannot imagine their lives without music. Driving to work without radio on the car radio. Going to bed without reading a story or a comic book. Watching some television. Going to the movies on the weekend. We just think that our lives would be appalling and not worth living. Setting aside the spin-offs. So if it's true that video games, for instance, are part of that, they're part of the art that's in our lives at the low end, the lowbrow end, rather than the highbrow end, that's okay, and we should accommodate and respect it from that perspective. We don't need to worry so much about whether it's just the hot new art craze that maybe doesn't have such great instrumental benefits. I'm not saying it doesn't, maybe it does, but that's not really what the issue is. The issue is, does it feed our hunger for art?
We ourselves, as I don't know whether, probably the right word is not species, but Homo sapiens is only supposed to be, what, about 50,000 years old? I think it's about 50,000, isn't it?
Well, modern Homo sapiens.
Okay.
I think that, Homo sapiens goes back much earlier.
Okay, so Homo sapiens isn't the right term. I'm not sure what.
But modern humans.
Modern humans. So 40,000 for the first instruments.
Well, what's a modern human? For an anthropologist, a modern human is a Homo sapiens which left behind traces of culture.
So that's the definition.
Yeah.
So it's by
because that's
definition.
an indicator that there's a certain cognitive level. If there are bone flutes and there are paintings on walls, that's an indicator that we had the same kinds of minds then as we have now.
Mm-hmm. So it's not looking, the dates are not so much based on looking at the skulls and the brain capacity as these other issues.
No, all of that is basically the same for hundreds of thousands of years. And then something happens. They call it the Big Bang. So 50,000 years ago, boom! You go from nothing but hundreds of thousands of years of little stone tools to art. It's just everywhere. Ornamentation, beads, manufacturing systems for making face paint. The remnants of those have been dug up. So we know that people were painting their bodies and painting their faces. Cosmetics, in other words. Once we had cosmetics and art, once we had minds of a certain level of sophistication, we began to decorate our lives and decorate ourselves with art.
Relation to play, I mean, dogs play, other animals play. So I wonder if there's what sort of relation there is between our capacity and level of play and that sort of activity.
I think that some scholars, philosophers, and anthropologists will say that there's a special kind of play that we can do that other animals can't do, and that is pretend play, where it's clear that we're imagining that a situation isn't what it appears to be. So that this pile of mud is a pie.
Right.
Children making mud pies. It's not just mud, it's a pie. And dogs play with tug toys and squeaky toys, and cats play with strings, but the toys are what they are, they would say, to the dogs and cats, and they're not something else. And so we're capable of imagining counterfactually, that's the technical term that philosophers use, imagining the world to be other than it is, and that becomes a source of play for us.
Yeah, well, in computer art, I mean, particularly if it's stuff that you experience at the screen, over the internet, say, the only input devices are the keyboard and the mouse, so really all you're doing is clicking a mouse and possibly typing into the keyboard, but there's the question of what are you really doing? Are you creating the universe, or are you just turning the page? So the artists have to think quite strongly about what those actions are interpreted as for people who are engaged, and make those as strong and interesting as possible.
Sometimes people underestimate the power of just a few simple devices. So a mouse, or think about a trackpad. Apple. I'm sure must be true for all kinds of computers nowadays, but I use Apple's, and I know that the trackpad, you can do various things with your fingers to control what happens. Those are called gestures. That is exactly the right word for Apple to use to describe those little interactions. Tap, tap, or spread, or shrink, or drag. Gestures, we all know this. We get angry and we drive. We do something that is just a simple physical movement, but it's fraught with meaning. It's totally loaded with meaning. And so people who say, well, all you're doing, what do you mean interactivity? All you're doing is clicking a mouse. They don't understand that the simplest gesture can carry huge amounts of meaning.
As it should in art.
As it should, yeah.
And maybe part of the value of computer art then is, McLuhan was right that technologies are extensions of us, like the microscope and the telescope are extensions of our capacity to see, and the computer is more a cognitive extension of us, of our capacities to think and our memory capacities. Then we get this incredible extension of us with computers, but it isn't quite human. It isn't. It's more like a metal claw extension of us than something that has blood going through it, and something that we can be articulate with, and feel with. So perhaps computer art is also about allowing us to make these extensions of us more fully human.
I think that it's very hard to separate the human from the non-human in our very close immediate environment. So much of what we do as people and what we care about, what we think of ourselves as capable of, depends on subtle, probably mostly transparent and visible dependencies on tools. I want to say tools rather than technology, because I don't think it matters whether there's electricity running through it or whether it's just heavy enough to be a hammer. They're all tools. Let me just illustrate to you. I remember when, although I started using computers when I was very young, in those days printers were very expensive. Extremely dot matrix printers, extremely expensive. I could never afford one. And so I never used a computer for word processing. I wrote longhand. And when you write, you're thinking as you write. And I found that writing longhand shaped the way I thought. Later, I came to use computers, and it's a completely different kind of writing experience. I get every sentence perfect in the first draft, I hope. Of course, I tear it all apart in the second draft, but I do, it's a different kind of writing process because it allows for immediate editing and changing. I think that my thought processes are shaped by the technology that I use, whether it's a pen in my hand or whether it's a keyboard beneath my fingers. And for me, if I'm a professor, writing is so much part of myself. I can't put a clear boundary between what's me there and what's the machine.
Right.
And I don't care about putting a clear boundary between what's me and what's the machine. I'd be devastated without some tool for writing. I'm sure you feel the same way as a poet.
Well, language itself is a technology. tool, if we think of technologies as tools made somewhat collectively by people.
I completely agree that language is a tool.
Right.
Yeah.
So our tools influence us more deeply than we usually understand.
That's a tool. Well, if we were deprived of that tool, it's a loss of self.
Mm-hmm.
That's a loss of consciousness.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are some people
yeah.
who say that thought without language there is no such thing.
I think that there's thought without language.
Yeah, so
you can draw images, but I think that there is a high level of self-awareness that we have that involves our telling stories about ourselves. I did this because that happened to me. Today I feel this way because yesterday this happened to me, And without language we can't have those thoughts, and so we can't have that high level of self-awareness.
Mm-hmm. Are there other things that you want to raise about your book, your brilliant book of philosophy of computer art, Dom?
I hope that people find it to be provocative. The idea isn't that everybody should agree with it. I wouldn't even say it would be nice if everybody agreed with it. Actually, it wouldn't be nice at all. What I hope to do is to stir up some discussion about what this new art form is and what its value is and what its place in our lives is. And be really interested to know what readers have to say about it, what they think.
Well, I wish you all the best with it. I think it is an important book in computer art and for the culture more broadly. And I wish you all the best with it. A Philosophy of Computer Art by Dominic Lopes.
Thank you.
Great to meet you.
Thank you very much.